Dylan never planned for the road to look the way it did that night. She had imagined many versions of the moment, some clean, some cruel, some so perfectly accidental that even she would believe in them, but none of them included the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, or the way her hands shook afterward as if they no longer belonged to her. The road was darker than it should have been, a thin ribbon of asphalt stretching between streetlights that flickered like exhausted witnesses. This was not panic territory. This was preparation territory. Dylan had rehearsed the sequence so many times in her mind that it no longer felt like an action, but a necessity, something inevitable rather than chosen. Electra had always stood in the way, not loudly, not maliciously, but with the quiet permanence of someone who belonged. And in Dylan's world, belonging was a threat more dangerous than hatred. From the moment Dylan had been invited to stay, everything shifted. What appeared to be generosity on the surface felt, to her, like a door left open just long enough for temptation to step inside. She told herself she was grateful, that she was lucky, that she should be content with proximity rather than possession. But gratitude rots when it sits next to desire for too long. Will's kindness was never casual. It was intimate in a way that blurred lines, in a way that made Dylan feel seen and chosen even when logic said otherwise. Electra was always there, though, a constant reminder that Dylan's place was conditional, borrowed, temporary. Every shared look between Will and Electra, every unspoken understanding, carved another quiet wound inside Dylan. She began to understand that love did not always announce itself as passion. Sometimes it arrived as resentment dressed up as patience. Luna had been the first warning sign, the first name Dylan learned to say in her head without emotion. Luna was not supposed to matter anymore, not after everything that had happened, not after she had supposedly been erased from the future. Yet Luna lingered like a ghost that refused to fade, a rival whose absence was more dangerous than her presence. Dylan had watched the way Will reacted whenever Luna's name surfaced, the way his posture changed, the way his eyes darkened with something unresolved. It became clear to Dylan that love, in Will's life, did not obey chronology. It resurfaced, reinvented itself, refused to stay buried. And that was when Dylan learned the most important lesson of all: removing a rival once was not enough. The threat had to be eliminated at the root. The night of the accident was not chaotic. That was the lie Dylan would tell later, and the lie she would almost believe herself. In truth, it was precise. She saw Electra before Electra saw her. That mattered. The road curved just enough to conceal intention, to allow timing to masquerade as chance. Dylan's foot pressed the accelerator, with a steadiness that terrified her even as it confirmed what she had already accepted about herself. There was a moment, brief, sharp, irreversible, when she could have stopped. That moment passed without resistance. The impact was violent, louder than she had imagined, the sound of metal colliding with flesh echoing through her body in waves. Dylan screamed, but it was not the scream of regret. It was the scream of survival. She did not expect the pain afterward. Not really. She had planned for damage, but pain has a way of personalizing consequences. The blood, the shock, the confusion, they grounded her in the reality of what she had done. It was important, she realized, that she be injured too. Victims are easier to believe when they bleed. As the world blurred and sirens grew closer, Dylan began the second half of the performance, the part that mattered more than the act itself. She cried not with calculation, but with desperation, repeating the story she had already written in her head. Electra crossed without looking. Electra stepped into the road. Electra did not see her coming. The truth was not erased, it was simply buried beneath repetition. Will's reaction unfolded exactly as Dylan had hoped, and that realization filled her with a cold relief she refused to name. He did not question. He did not hesitate. He rushed to her side, his concern immediate and unquestioning, his anger aimed outward rather than inward. In his eyes, Dylan was fragile, shaken, traumatized by an accident she never asked for. His arms around her felt like victory and absolution intertwined. The fact that Electra lay broken somewhere else did not compete with the urgency of Dylan's tears. Tragedy, Dylan understood, always chooses where it lands its weight. In the days that followed, the narrative hardened into fact. Investigations began, but doubt never gained traction. Dylan's injuries served as proof of innocence, her emotional collapse reinforcing the image of a woman undone by circumstance rather than design. Will became her anchor, her shield against suspicion, her proof that love could be secured through survival. Every time he defended her, every time he dismissed the idea of intent, something inside Dylan relaxed further into certainty. She had not just removed a rival, she had rewritten her own role in the story. She was no longer the outsider. She was the wounded woman who needed protection. Yet peace never arrived the way Dylan expected. Instead, something darker followed. The absence of Electra created space, but space has a way of inviting questions rather than answers. Memories resurfaced in unexpected ways. Dylan found herself revisiting moments she thought she had resolved, images of Luna that refused to stay still. And then came the whispers, the subtle shifts in tone, the suggestion that Luna was not as gone as everyone believed. A sighting here. A rumor there. Nothing solid, nothing provable, but enough to unsettle the narrative Dylan had worked so carefully to stabilize. The idea of a second Luna did not frighten Dylan at first. It angered her. The possibility that her past actions had not been final, that the threat she believed she had neutralized might still exist in another form, felt like an insult to the precision she prided herself on. If Luna could return, if Luna could be reborn as something else, then Dylan's understanding of control was incomplete. And that realization cracked something open inside her. For the first time, she questioned whether love secured through elimination could ever remain secure. Will, meanwhile, remained unchanged in his faith. His trust in Dylan was unwavering, his belief in her innocence absolute. That trust became both her shield and her prison. Every expression of comfort tightened the walls around her, every word of reassurance reinforcing the lie she now had to live inside. She began to recognize the cost of success. To keep what she had gained, Dylan would have to maintain the illusion indefinitely. The truth could not surface, not about Electra, not about Luna, not about the pattern forming beneath her actions. The emergence of a second Luna, whether real or symbolic, forced Dylan to confront a terrifying possibility, that she was not reacting to threats, but creating them. That love, once weaponized, demands constant reinforcement. That the road she chose that night did not end with Electra. It extended forward, winding, dark, and unforgiving. Dylan understood now that the most dangerous part of her story was not the accident itself, but the calm that followed. Calm invites reflection. Reflection invites doubt. And doubt is the enemy of carefully constructed lies. In the quiet moments, when Will was not watching and the world was not demanding tears, Dylan replayed the impact again and again, not with guilt, but with analysis. She wondered if she would do it differently, if she would choose another road, another moment. The answer disturbed her in its clarity. She would not change the outcome. She would only refine the method. That realization did not make her monstrous in her own eyes. It made her honest. She had crossed a threshold where intention no longer required justification. Survival had become synonymous with control. And so the question lingered, unresolved and dangerous. Was Luna truly gone? Or had she simply transformed into something harder to recognize? Was the second Luna a person, a memory, or a consequence? Dylan did not know. What she did know was that the story was not finished. Elektra's absence had solved one problem, but it had exposed another, deeper truth about the world Dylan now inhabited. Love, once taken by force, does not rest. It demands vigilance. It demands sacrifice. And it demands a willingness to keep driving forward, even when the road disappears into darkness. Dylan did not leave anything to chance that night. The most dangerous lie is not the one improvised in panic, but the one prepared long before fear ever arrives, shaped patiently until it feels indistinguishable from truth. She had studied the rhythm of Elektra's movements with the attentiveness of someone pretending not to care, noting habits that others dismissed as coincidence. The hour when Elektra crossed that particular stretch of road was never accidental. It was part of a routine born of comfort, familiarity, and the quiet arrogance of safety. Dylan understood that safety breeds blindness. People who believe they are seen, protected, and loved stop looking twice. That knowledge became her opening. Timing, for Dylan, was not merely about seconds, but about emotional readiness. She waited until everything else was in place, until Will's sense of responsibility toward her had already been gently cultivated through weeks of proximity, gratitude, and vulnerability. She had made herself someone who needed care without demanding it, someone whose fragility seemed organic rather than staged. By the time Elektra stepped onto the road that night, Dylan was no longer a guest lingering on the edge of Will's life. She was a presence already woven into his instinct to protect. The accident, when it came, was not an interruption. It was an acceleration. The car moved forward with deliberate calm. Dylan's hands were steady on the wheel, her breath controlled, her eyes locked not on the road itself, but on the moment when inevitability would replace choice. Elektra's figure appeared exactly where Dylan expected, illuminated briefly by the headlights, like a revelation that came too late to matter. There was no swerve dramatic enough to suggest confusion, no brake slammed in desperate regret. The impact was violent but contained, the kind of collision that would later be described as sudden, shocking, and impossible to predict. Dylan screamed, not because she was surprised, but because she understood the value of sound. Shock must be audible to be believed. The preparation did not end with the collision. Dylan had anticipated pain, but she had also calculated its limits. The injury she sustained was not severe enough to draw suspicion, yet not minor enough to be dismissed. It was the perfect wound, visible and inconvenient, a physical marker of trauma that demanded sympathy without inviting scrutiny. Blood on her skin told a story before she ever spoke. Her body became the first piece of evidence, her trembling hands the second. By the time help arrived, Dylan was already performing the version of herself she intended the world to remember. Her face, pale and stricken, reflected genuine fear, though not for the reasons anyone assumed. Fear, in that moment, was not about consequences but about precision. She had to get it right. The narrative had to be simple enough to travel quickly, emotional enough to outrun doubt. Elektra crossed carelessly. Elektra did not look. Elektra stepped into danger without awareness. Dylan repeated these fragments through tears that blurred her vision just enough to feel authentic. No one questions a woman who appears broken by guilt she claims not to deserve. Will arrived at the scene already primed to believe her. His reaction was immediate, instinctive, and devastatingly effective. He wrapped his arms around Dylan without hesitation, shielding her from the chaos, as if she were the true casualty. In that embrace, something irreversible occurred. Witnesses saw not a driver who had struck someone, but a man comforting a woman in shock. The visual language of protection replaced the logic of investigation. Someone raised a phone, and the image captured in that instant would soon circulate across Los Angeles, while holding Dylan, as if anchoring her to the world, his expression fierce with concern, has collapsed into him like a confession of innocence. The photograph traveled faster than facts ever could. In a city trained to consume emotion before context, the image became the story. Dylan's tear-streaked face and Will's protective posture transformed the accident into a moral narrative rather than a legal one. Doubt, in the presence of such visible tenderness, began to look cruel. Anyone who questioned Dylan's account risked appearing heartless, accusatory, unwilling to extend grace to someone clearly suffering. Suspicion was reframed as brutality, and sympathy became a shield more effective than any lawyer could offer. As the days passed, the story hardened into consensus. Dylan was the victim of circumstance, Electra the tragic casualty of a moment's inattention. The language surrounding the incident softened where it needed to and sharpened where it mattered least. Headlines spoke of shock and grief, of lives changed in an instant, of the cruelty of fate. The absence of intent was assumed, not proven, but repetition turned assumption into fact. Dylan's injuries were cited again and again as proof that no one would willingly place themselves in harm's way. The logic was flawed, but it was comforting, and comfort is often mistaken for truth. Will's unwavering support completed the illusion. His refusal to entertain doubt functioned as a public endorsement of Dylan's innocence. He did not merely stand by her, he became her advocate, her witness, her living evidence. Every gesture of care reinforced the narrative that Dylan had already set in motion. When he appeared beside her at the hospital, when he guided her through crowds, when his hand remained at her back as if shielding her from invisible threats, the world saw devotion, not complicity. Love, when visible, has a way of absolving without trial. Inside Dylan, however, there was no peace. Victory does not arrive quietly when it is built on calculation. Instead, it hums beneath the skin, demanding constant awareness. She replayed the sequence endlessly, not with regret, but with analysis. She examined every detail, every glance, every moment when something could have gone wrong. The image of Will holding her at the scene resurfaced again and again, not as comfort, but as confirmation. She had not merely survived the accident. She had shaped its meaning. What unsettled her most was not the fear of exposure, but the realization of how easily the world accepted the version she offered. The truth had not needed to be hidden aggressively. It simply needed competition, and Dylan had provided a more emotionally satisfying alternative. People wanted to believe in her innocence, because it allowed them to believe in their own compassion. To question her would have required them to confront the possibility that empathy itself could be manipulated. That discomfort was far more threatening than the idea of a careless accident. Electra's absence became louder with each passing day. In the silence she left behind, Dylan found herself both relieved and haunted. The road was clear now, but clarity has a way of revealing what lies beneath intention. Dylan began to understand that what she had done was not an isolated act, but a pattern realized. The same logic that led her to eliminate one obstacle could be applied again, refined and justified under the guise of necessity. That recognition did not horrify her. It steadied her. The photograph continued to circulate, resurfacing whenever conversation drifted toward doubt. It became a visual argument against suspicion, a reminder of how cruelty could masquerade as concern. Dylan learned to live inside that image, to align her expressions and reactions with the version of herself the world had already accepted. She grieved publicly when required, accepted comfort gracefully, and allowed her vulnerability to remain visible just enough to discourage scrutiny. Her performance did not feel like deception. It felt like maintenance. Will never wavered. His belief in Dylan became part of his identity, a stance he defended with quiet certainty. In protecting her, he protected the image of himself as someone capable of recognizing goodness, of choosing compassion over cynicism. Dylan recognized this dynamic instinctively. His trust was not blind, it was invested. To doubt her would have meant doubting his own judgment, and that was a step he was unwilling to take. Love, she realized, is often less about the other person than about preserving one's self-image. The city moved on, as cities always do, but the consequences of that night continued to ripple outward. Dylan felt them in the way people looked at her, in the careful gentleness of their voices, in the unspoken assumption that she had suffered enough. The absence of accusation became its own form of validation. She was no longer defending herself. She was being defended by the story itself. Yet beneath the surface of acceptance, something darker stirred. Dylan began to notice how easily tragedy could be curated, how emotion could be staged and consumed without resistance. The realization was intoxicating and unsettling in equal measure. She had not just survived scrutiny, she had mastered it. The world had not demanded truth. It had demanded coherence, and she had delivered. The road where Electra died returned to Dylan's thoughts more often than she expected. Not as a place of guilt, but as a reminder of precision. It represented the moment when intention crystallized into action, when desire shed its ambiguity and became choice. Dylan understood now that the most dangerous part of that night was not the impact itself, but the aftermath, the way reality bent to accommodate the narrative she offered. That bending revealed a terrifying possibility, that control, once tasted, does not easily release its hold. And so Dylan moved forward, carrying her injuries like credentials, her tears like currency, and the photograph like a talisman against doubt. She had learned that innocence does not need to be earned if it can be convincingly displayed. In a city that worships appearances, Dylan had not merely escaped judgment. She had rewritten it. And as long as Will's arms remained a shield and the image of that night remained untarnished, the truth would stay exactly where she needed it to be, buried beneath compassion, protected by love, and rendered untouchable by belief. The funeral ended the way tragedies in Los Angeles always did, beneath a sky that was too blue to feel appropriate, surrounded by people who spoke in hushed tones not because they were overwhelmed by grief, but because grief demanded a performance of restraint. Flowers crowded the space where Electra's name had already begun to harden into memory, their fragrance cloying, excessive, almost aggressive, as if trying to overpower the finality of what had happened. Will stood still through it all, his posture rigid, his face composed in the way people mistake for strength. Inside him, however, something had gone disturbingly quiet. Grief had not arrived as a wave or a collapse. It had arrived as a pause, a suspended breath that refused to release. Dylan stayed close, close enough to be seen, close enough to be needed. Her tears came easily that day, not because Electra was gone, but because the absence created a vacuum that demanded emotion. She filled it convincingly. Her hands shook when they were supposed to, her voice faltered when attention turned her way, her body leaned instinctively toward Will as if she, too, were trying to remain upright in the face of unbearable loss. To anyone watching, she was another victim of a senseless tragedy, someone caught in the crossfire of fate. What no one could see was the careful calibration beneath the surface, the way Dylan measured every expression against the weight of the moment, ensuring nothing broke the illusion she had worked so hard to construct. It was after the funeral, when the crowd thinned and the world attempted to resume its rhythm, that the message arrived. Will's phone vibrated softly in his hand, a mundane interruption that felt immediately wrong. He expected condolences, perhaps another reminder of obligations postponed by grief. Instead, what he saw was a single line of text from a number that should not have existed, a sentence so brief it barely registered as language, yet unmistakable in its tone. It was not threatening. It did not need to be. It carried the same unsettling intimacy that Luna's messages once had, the same sense of being watched rather than addressed, the same implication that the sender knew something they should not. The shock did not announce itself loudly. Will felt it as a tightening behind his eyes, a subtle distortion of the world around him. The idea that Luna could reach him now, after everything, after death had supposedly sealed the past, made no sense. The number had no history, no traceable origin, and yet it was active, present, disturbingly real. Technology offered no explanation, and reason provided no comfort. Grief, when unsettled, has a way of resurrecting old fears, and this message felt like a door opening where one should not exist. Dylan noticed the change in him immediately. She always did. His silence deepened, his attention fractured, and she understood, with a clarity that bordered on relief, exactly what had happened. She had anticipated this moment long before the funeral, long before Electra's death became a certainty. The reappearance of Luna, even as an echo, even as a suggestion, was not a complication. It was an opportunity. Dylan's body responded before her mind finished the calculation. Her breathing quickened, her eyes widened, and she let fear rise to the surface just enough to be convincing. She spoke of being haunted, of feeling watched, of the way trauma can resurrect old ghosts. She framed herself as another target, another casualty of Luna's lingering shadow. Will believed her because belief was easier than confronting the alternative. The idea that Luna's presence might not be overfit neatly into his unresolved grief, into the sense that nothing in his life ever truly ended cleanly. Dylan's reaction mirrored his own unease closely enough to feel genuine. She trembled not with guilt, but with precision, aligning her fear with his so seamlessly that the two became indistinguishable. If Luna had returned, then Dylan was not a suspect. She was a fellow victim. What Will could not see, what no one could see, was the structure beneath Dylan's performance. Luna was no longer a person to her. She was a construct, a vessel emptied of humanity, and refilled with utility. Dylan had resurrected her not out of nostalgia or obsession, but because Luna was perfect.